efforts in reducing the negative impact of loss of correspondent banking relationships in the Caribbean, the role of supervisors and financial institutions. Introduction. This session should be read in combination with the concepts reviewed in previous sessions. As we saw in the last session, the effectiveness of the internal AML-CF system can be analyzed from 2 points of view. First, on the side of the supervisories, RSA, the effectiveness of the internal system is mainly related to the supervision activities. And second, the perspective of financial institutions. The effectiveness of the internal system is mainly related to customer due diligence. In consequence, during this session, we'll clarify the applicability of the concepts exposed as applicable to regulation and supervision authorities, RSA, or financial institutions. What does the FATF refer to as effectiveness? It is the extent to which the defined outcomes are achieved. Remember that in the framework of mutual evaluation process, the FATF evaluates the level of compliance with the 4 recommendations in regard to the formal compliance with the loss regulations and institutions. And in parallel, it reviews the level of compliance with 11 immediate outcomes that are the equivalent of the 4 recommendations as effectiveness standards. In terms to evaluate the level of effectiveness of certain systems, in the case of prevention system regarding the obligations and requirements for the financial institutions and the supervision, the following are the most important issues that we must take into consideration. On one site, the technical assessment seeks to assess the extent to which the legal and institutional framework are in place in the country, and in the case of evaluation of effectiveness, it seeks to assess the extent to which those legal institutions' frameworks are producing the expected results. So what are the defined outcomes in relation to internal systems? These are the 3 more important issues taken into consideration. 1. The first one is preparing and processing suspicious transaction reports in a timely and proper manner for the financial institutions. 2. Having an internal audit of the AML-CFT system for the financial institutions and the supervision procedures. 3. And making a proper allocation of human resources, in terms of number, training, experience, internal hierarchy, and powers. We already mentioned there were some issues detected in terms of human resources in the Caribbean region. Okay, so the first point, preparing and processing suspicious transaction reports in a timely and proper manner. The FATF immediate outcome N4 mentions the adequate application of AML-CFT preventative measures commensurate with the identified risks, and as consequence, the adequate making or processing of suspicious transactions reports as a sign of an effective system. We all know that the goal of the preventative measures is to facilitate the ability of the subjects, particularly the financial institutions, to detect suspicious reports and be able to report them to the competent authorities. In this case, those reports must be issued in a timely manner, which means that the STR is prepared in the preventative stage, not uniquely as a reactive measure once a press match was detected, and processing the STR in a reasonable time. Proper manner means that the STR is prepared with sufficient and truthful information as much as possible, and processing the received information based on the criteria of reasonability. The second point, having an internal audit of the AML-CFT system for the financial institutions and having an internal audit of the supervision procedures for the regulation and supervision authorities. The FATF RBA guidance for the banking sector issued in 2014 states that the internal controls are a prerequisite for the effective implementation of policies and processes to mitigate MLTF risk. So internal audit of the AML-CFT system of the supervision procedures is one of the most important types of internal controls and implies testing the function and measuring its results, detecting weaknesses and proposing adjustments for better results, having a committee or similar internal body with sufficient authority and independence to perform the above. If we look at the immediate outcomes and we do what it indicates in relation to supervisors, it is important to notice that for supervisors, they must have all the tools and entities as well as a good internal policies, and transparent procedures, manuals, and staff under control. Making a proper allocation of human resources in terms of the number, training experience, internal hierarchy, and powers. All the official sources, FATF, ASBA, IDB, CDB, highlight the importance in making a proper allocation of human resources with regard to the personnel in charge of applying AML-CFT in the case of financial institutions or supervision in relation to the RSA policies and procedures. But what would be understood as proper in this context? According to the experience and the information gathered from Caribbean entities, the following minimum standards can be stated as recommendation, 1. A minimum percentage for the compliance or inspection department around the 5% of the total staff of the entity, and a minimum quantity of AML CFT trainings per employee in a year, 2 approximately per year. What's the minimum years of experience for the head of compliance department in the case of financial institutions? Approximately 5 years, and for the head of the inspective body in the case of regulation supervision authorities is 10 years approximately. Now, what are the minimum hierarchy powers for the head of compliance department? They must be able to make decisions about the preparation or not of a STR. They should have a direct communication with competent authorities, judicial power, financial intelligence unit, and others. In the case of the head of the inspective department, he or she may be able to take decisions about applying sanctions, must have direct communication with supervised entities, and must be under the direct hierarchy of the board of directors or equivalent body. Why all this represents a way to reduce de-risking? First, as the previous speaker said, there is a perception of the Caribbean as a high-risk region of the correspondent banks, and that is a fact. So, based on the review of the information, it was concluded that as a condition to provide or reestablish the correspondent banking service, the CBs implicitly require an adequate AML CFT environment, resulting from a series of external and internal factors. The first one is a general element, which is the application of coordinated institutional AML CFT framework. It means the existence of a national AML CFT system. And for that, remember that the FATF recommendation requires the countries to understand and comprehend the national risk. And to do that, it is recommended that countries must conduct a national risk assessment as well as have a national strategy that takes into consideration the results of the national risk assessment. And this national strategy must contain a risk-based approach to regulate the components of the system. And for the implementation of those strategies, it is important to have a good coordination of all the system components, not only between the competent authorities, but also between the financial institutions and private entities. And as has been said previously, one of the most important concerns in the FATF systems relate with the information sharing between obligate subjects and among the financial institutions in order to strengthen the preventative system as a whole. And the second issue is about the preventative measures and internal controls procedures adopted in the local financial system must be coherent. In terms of international cooperation, it is important to ensure there's a good relationship between the Caribbean countries and also the extra-regional countries. It is also important to ensure that the institution have a good reputation, and in the case of correspondent banking service provider, it is also important that the country and geographic region has a good reputation. For all this is relevant to improve internal cooperation among the countries that are part of the Caribbean region in all these matters. Taking into consideration the previous points, Caribbean entities, as well as Caribbean countries, need to make their best efforts to improve the effectiveness of their internal AML CFT systems, as mentioned in point 1. For this reason, it can be concluded that the effectiveness of internal AML CFT systems is a way to reduce de-risking. Thank you, see you in the next section.